Howdy, today I'm Flippin Science looking at reproductive isolation. So science understanding, we're going to look at different species show different features that help maintain their reproductive isolation, and reproductive isolating mechanisms may be pre-zygotic or post-zygotic. So here's a question. Is a mule its own species? So, in our definition of species, we talked about how the offspring produced need to be fertile. In this case, a mule isn't fertile. It's produced from a horse and a donkey, and it can't have its own babies. So because of this, is it a species or not? You can't have babies, so we would say no, based on one definition of species. We'll look at why they can't have babies later on. So like I said in our definition of species, we need to be able to produce fertile offspring with members of the same species. Members of one species are reproductively isolated from other species if they can't produce fertile offspring. And the mechanisms that prevent two different species from mating and producing fertile offspring, this is called reproductive isolation. This is an important step on the pathway to speciation. To making a new species, you need to be reproductively isolated. You can't have offspring with other species. There's a few different methods of reproductive isolation. We're going to go into those now. We classify the methods that prevent the production of fertile offspring as either pre-zygotic or post-zygotic. So pre-zygotic, this prevents the formation of a zygote. So this stops mating, or it prevents successful mating from occurring. It stops the offspring being produced before it is a zygote. This is when before the eggs and sperm meet. In post-zygotic mechanisms, the egg and sperm do meet and we do get fertilization occurring, but the offspring that's produced is incapable of reproducing itself. And we'll look at both of these methods. So we'll start with pre-zygotic. So pre-zygotic isolation methods prevent the two species from producing a zygote. So a zygote is the fertilized product of the egg and sperm meeting. Because the zygote isn't produced, fertile offspring aren't given birth to. So all of this is very much animal-based. We're focusing on animals here, not necessarily other kingdoms. In ecological isolation, this is where two species can't mate because they don't live in the same area. So down here we have a good example with some spotted owls. So they're spotted owl species, so they're fairly closely related. We can see that their scientific name is very similar, so in this case they're different subspecies. They're separated by a huge mountain range over here in the US. So we have the Mexican spotted owl in the southwest, and then we have the northern spotted owl on the west coast. So there's a big mountain range through here, and that separates them. So because they can't access each other, they can't have offspring with each other. Temporal isolation is where different species mate at different times. So down here we have some frogs. So the peak mating activity occurs at different times of the year for both species. There is a bit of crossover here. So we might get some reproduction here, but because the main mating times is different, the production of offspring is very, very low of the hybrid between these two. Mechanical isolation is where the reproductive organs aren't compatible. Down here we have a good example with snails. If you notice carefully, the shells of the snails are going in opposite directions. So what that means is the body plans are flipped. So where the genitals would meet, they don't. So here we can see where the genital openings are on the neck. In this case, the genital openings don't match up, and because of that, the reproductive organs can't access each other. This occurs to a really interesting degree in insects, for example. The genital shapes just get very, very convoluted between different species, and it's a good way of determining the different species of very closely related insects is by looking at their genitals and seeing if they match up. So there's a job for you. Behavioral isolation is where members of different species don't impress the opposite gender with courtship displays, mating rituals, but they could be things like pheromones being produced. So pheromones are chemicals that could be used for communication. If the pheromones are produced don't match up, then we don't get reproduction happening. Let's have a look at an example of this in blue-footed boobies. So here are blue-footed boobies. They have a very elaborate courtship display. So there's a dance, there's pointing, there's singing, there's all kinds of things that are going on. And that's for the male trying to impress the female. If the female isn't impressed, then mounting doesn't occur and reproduction doesn't happen. So if you're a member of a completely different species, you're very unlikely to be able to pull off the same courtship displays of the other species that you're trying to get it on with. And therefore it just doesn't happen. So over here we have an example with birdsong. So birdsong, we have different species of birds make different songs, and the males are trying to impress the females when they're trying to reproduce. If the songs don't match up, if the female is impressed by the male song, then she's just not going to mate with him. In gametic isolation, the gametes, so the sex cells, so the eggs and sperm, from one species, they can meet the eggs and sperm of the other species, but they just aren't compatible with each other. So down here we have sea urchins, for example. Sea urchins release their eggs and sperm into water, and so the eggs and sperm can mix quite readily. But the different species, sperm and eggs, they just don't, the sperm doesn't make it into the egg, so therefore fertilization doesn't occur, and therefore a zygote isn't produced. So they're types of pre-zygotic isolation. Post-zygotic isolation is where a hybrid is produced, but the hybrid can't have viable or offspring that can produce their own babies. So a hybrid is when you have two species producing offspring. So our example here that we're going to talk about in terms of hybrid sterility is a mule. So what happens with post-zygotic mechanisms is that the hybrid can't pass on their genes to the next generation. If they do, the next generation is not very viable. So let's look at our example from the mule that we talked about at the start of the video. So horses have 64 chromosomes in their regular body cells, and that's 32 in each of their sex cells, because we get a halving. In donkeys, they have 62 chromosomes in their normal body cells, and that means they have 31 in their sex cells that are produced. So when we have the sperm and the egg meeting, the number of chromosomes that a mule has in its normal body cells is 63. And that's not an even number, and because it's not an even number, that makes producing viable sex cells very difficult, because the sex cells don't have the right number of chromosomes in them. So because the number of chromosomes doesn't divide into two neatly, the donkey produced, which is a male, its sperm isn't viable, so it can't produce offspring. So now it's time for another question. What would you call the offspring between a lion and a leopard? So the answer is it depends. If you have a male lion with a female leopard, you get a leopard. If you have a male leopard with a female lion, you get a leopard. In both cases, the offspring produced aren't viable. So our example there is where we have hybrid inviability. So the embryos are produced, but the embryo doesn't develop into viable offspring. So the offspring may be born, but body systems don't develop, and the offspring dies before sexual maturity. And this is the case with both hybrids between the leopards and the lions. Occasionally this does happen and the offspring is produced, but they die before they reach sexual maturity. Often the embryo just doesn't develop, but if it does develop and the offspring is born, they often die fairly early on before they reach sexual maturity. So they get the opportunity to produce offspring. So in Flipping Science, we looked at reproductive isolation. That's it for Flipping Science Day. See ya!